Namaste, welcome to Nepali Times Studio. I am Sikumara, your host for this episode. Today we are here in the office of Dolma Impact Fund in Darbarmarg. The company is the first international private equity fund dedicated to multiple productive sectors in Nepal. So here we have Tim Gocher, the director of Dolma Impact Fund, to speak with us. Welcome, Mr. Gocher.
Thank you. Namaste.
It looks like you have quite a soft spot for Nepal. How did this connection to the country come across?
I think us in the West are seeking something. I think our society is what it is. I think we're seeking a peace. And I think when I found myself in remote Himalayan villages, I almost found what I was looking for. At least I might have found a path to begin to find it. And I think something there is the magic. But I have to say the real magic was my wife, who I met 15 years ago in Nepal. She's Nepali, she's Gurung.
And how did you come up with Dolma Impact Fund?
Well, I met a girl called Dolma, hence the name, and she wasn't going to school. She was 9 years old, and I just sponsored her for education, as many people do. But that really grew into a kind of grassroots voluntary non-profit, which became the Dolma Foundation. But actually I'm from a private sector background, so I lived a double life. I had this voluntary charity, and yet I was working for investment banks or doing sort of private sector work in Singapore, New York, London. And I wanted to bring the two together. I wanted to bring the power of markets and capital to stimulate sustainable growth. Not just giving. I think it's great to give. I think there's room for that. But I also think there's a lot of room for investment. And the kind of rigor and governance and transfer of knowledge that can bring. And I think come 2011, I was very satisfied that this country was going to be at peace, which is the basic fundamental for investment, is security of asset. And that's when I decided to launch the Impact Fund.
So you said you have two projects in hydropower, and you are slowly moving towards peak demand generation from solar. So how did this transition come through?
Because we saw companies across the board operating at this cost disadvantage, we wanted to use new energy technology to rapidly help fill that gap with domestic energy production. And I think the country has relied on hydropower quite rightly, and with solar it's difficult for the grid to take because of the intermittency of solar. Every time a cloud goes over, the energy will go up and down. With a small installed capacity, that's very difficult to manage. It's been very interesting what's been happening in battery storage. And we think now we can provide, through Dolma Himalayan Climate Fund, a solution which is very similar to the seasonal hydro storage, the sort of West Seti type projects, where they would deliver dispatchable power on an as-needed basis in the dry season, in hydro case by storing water in the summer months. In our case, we generate through solar. It would go through the batteries, take out that intermittency, but also be able to shift the generation to the power to the evening peak when it's needed the most. So in a sense, that's dispatching power in the dry season. The beauty of some of the new technologies is the speed. So while the country very much needs the big hydro storage plants, they will of course take a long time, perhaps a decade, to build. What we see in Australia with the Tesla battery solution recently is it was built in 6 months. Now Nepal is not Australia, it will take a little longer than that, but we are talking about the first installation in 2 years after the signing of the PDA with the investment board, and then very rapid expansion potentially after that. So it's not going to replace hydro by any means, but it does give Nepal another option. It does give Nepal one other energy option, which should directly offset some of the imports from India.
It is first of a kind in Nepal. What do you think are the chances that it will be upgraded to the 850 megawatt scheme?
I think there's realism on both sides, both the government side and the Dolma side. And obviously the ability, so we did have 150 megawatts of solar with some battery capacity approved by the investment board. And it will depend on how that operates with the grid, whether we can meet our targets for installation. Obviously, it'll depend on the cost that we can provide that for. But I think if we can do that, the best way to mitigate that is get a world-class team. And I think with Dr. Sandeep Shah, with Mike Winkel, who managed 60,000 megawatts in his portfolio at energy giant E.ON, and the great team of consultants and staff we have working for that project, that's the best way to do it. Blending Nepali world-class talent with international world-class talent is the best way to mitigate. But there's lots of unknowns, and we need to do a lot of testing first.
Being the first private international equity fund in Nepal, and giving reference to your experience in Nepal, how do you think the prospect of such equity funds will be in Nepal in the future?
Because it takes risk alongside local promoters, it's a very important driver of economic growth. So if you look at India, for example, still today more than 50% of the foreign direct investment is private equity. And because it is, without more equity, there's not more debt, if you like. So to really stimulate a company, somebody has to come in there with the funds. And it's not just the capital. When you see a company, a founder, an entrepreneur wanting to grow to the extent where local capital will be exhausted, where they want to take on some of the environmental and social governance that we do, some of the corporate governance, things that will open up perhaps export markets, other capital markets, international providers. When we can align our capital with that kind of determination is when we see the best results. So I think, just like most developing countries, I think private equity is a vital thing, and we've seen a lot of the results already in our portfolio companies.
Can you tell us how you see the political and economic future of Nepal?
Well, I think what we tend to see, I've invested in many countries and done business in many countries, and I think there is obviously need for reform. I think there's an understanding of that in the current government. I've been asked to speak to various ministries about how private sector runs and is regulated in other countries. I think we tend to see some restrictive things which are meant well. The problem is if you have a small book value like a technology innovative company, you simply won't list your shares. So I think it's about understanding where perhaps things that are meant well actually might stop the initial investment, growth, job creation and prosperity. So we see a number of those things, but it doesn't stop us. We were certainly well aware of them before we came in. We're able to invest international quality money and grow. We now provide employment in our portfolio companies for around 3,000 people. And I think it's just the pleasure of the people. Sure, the regulations aren't perfect. Where else can you go and meet a minister, meet the governor, where they'll hear you out? They're not always going to act, sometimes they do, but they certainly listen to you. And the relationships that you build here are wonderful. I mean, the warmth and openness of people is, again, perhaps part of the magic that I found 15 years ago, but that's the pleasure. It's not all mapped out for us business people and us investors. It is risky, but you also feel like you're part of something bigger. It's not just about the money. If it was just about the money, I'd be in London or New York still. So there's something here about creating a greater, more prosperous Nepal that you're at least a small part in that puzzle that I really enjoy.
It's a wrap for today. Thank you, Mr. Gocher.
My pleasure. Thank you.